So with that, we're going to move into our first segment. And as always, if you have comments, questions, you can put them in the chat or even better in the Q&A window. And as always, we really appreciate and value your feedback. So you can always hit us up at musicpolicyforum@gmail.com. But our first segment today is talking about something that we're really excited about here in Music Policy Forum, Music Cities Together, and Sound Music Cities Land, which is a framework that has been developed by hundreds of arts institutions over the last period of months to really put some specificity around this key question of how do we get our creative workers back to work, particularly in an era of COVID. And we're thrilled that we're joined by Americans for the Arts Vice President for Strategic Initiatives, Clord. Clay, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we're really excited about what you all, and we want to be clear, this is not an Americans for the Arts initiative. This is a community initiative that you're speaking on behalf of today. But one of the reasons we're so excited about this is, all of us feel this sense of like, what do we have control over? In a world where we don't have any control and there's just significant vulnerability and emotional exhaustion and just everything. And what came out, in the last couple of weeks is like forward-looking, positive, it's a real framework for things that we can do and that we can ask our federal government to do beyond, funding and other things. Could you walk us through kind of this concept and how it came about and sort of what are the things that we should be taking away from the proposals?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's exactly right, what you've said there in terms of this is really an attempt to begin a process of reimagining our creative economy, of rethinking how the creative economy can be part of the recovery, and really of trying to rearrange the thinking of people who aren't necessarily as familiar with arts, culture, and the creative economy so that they can get into a mindset of putting creative workers to work towards the recovery rather than providing handouts to people who aren't necessarily working. And we absolutely know there are a bunch of people who aren't working. Right now, our research at Americans for the Arts says something like 2/3 of all of the artists and creative workers in the United States are out of work. That's a really significant challenge. North of $60 billion in lost income that we anticipate for the creative economy overall in just 2020. And as the timeline extends on relief, we want to also bring into that conversation recovery as a concept. And that's particularly important because the creative sector, as I'm sure you know, is going to be a little bit behind that curve of movement towards recovery compared to some other sectors in the overall economy. And so we need to start thinking about this now, and we need to have other people thinking about the viability of the 5.1 million creative workers here in the United States, the fact that we generate, when we're healthy and everything's running, almost $900 billion in GDP, towards the GDP in a given year. We are a really active and vibrant engine that needs to be part of that restart, not as a handout, but as an essential component. What we're starting to say now is there is no recovery without creativity. And so as part of that, as you mentioned, we worked with a coalition of what started at about 100 organizations to develop this proposal, which can be found at americansforthearts.org/creative work. It has 15 different sort of very short policy proposals in it that cover things like direct employment of creative workers by the federal government, like the distribution of funds from the federal government to local, state, tribal, and private sector partners in order to support them in putting creative workers back to work more quickly. Adjusting existing federal as well as state and local policies that currently discriminate against creative workers and other independent workers, and that need to be adjusted in order to accommodate that giant percentage of the workforce, 55 million people who currently are only temporarily accessing unemployment benefits, and actually currently not right now, as well as are discriminated against in terms of food policy, housing policy, copyright, things like that. It also covers some policies about integrating creative organizations and creative workers preemptively in sort of future recovery and resiliency efforts, so that we're not considered an afterthought, we're considered an integral part of nurturing and reinforcing the creative life of a community at a fragile moment, and dealing with issues of trauma that can occur and are occurring right now for every American. And finally, creating better and broader access to arts culture and arts education, including by subsidizing cultural organizations, individual workers, commissioning new work that can occur in public spaces that can be accessed for free or low cost, as well as investing in the digital transformation of the cultural economy, integrating goals around broadband access for everyone, but also around educating the creative sector and people in the creative sector, so that we are better able to put our work into the digital space, and we have the tools and agreements in order to make sure that that's done equitably, and that creative workers end up being paid fairly for the distribution of their work into the digital spaces.
Thank you for that overview. And again, Alex has put a link into the chat, and everybody can kind of dig into this. It's a very dense document, and that's meant as a compliment, just in terms of the sort of depth of the ideas that are reflected there. And it's, part of what makes it so important or so interesting from our standpoint is we've talked often about, the sort of structural advocacy challenges of looking at things like NEA budget as some sort of proxy for cultural policy. And when we know that the needs are so dramatic, and certainly in this year, unfortunately, that's been that much more stark, especially for those of you who watched Michael Seaman's presentation on our program a couple of weeks ago. We know the numbers, and bringing Hakim Bellamy in. Hakim is a working artist who also is part of the Cultural Services Department in Albuquerque, so he's got multiple kind of perspectives on this. One of the things I heard a lot, Hakim, and I'd be curious on your take, is, we can, at the same time that we can celebrate and be appreciative of freelancers and artists being eligible for unemployment benefits, what we hear a lot anecdotally is that people want to go to work. I mean, people want opportunities, they want to be paid, they want create stuff. And so, when Hakim, when you look at this document, what are some of your takeaways and kind of what's your sense of it?
Definitely. And thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, Michael. I think that, Clay's work, right where Clay ended right there, I think is hugely important. So I'm just going to double down on that. There's so many different aspects to this document. The City of Albuquerque Cultural Services Department has endorsed this document. We feel like it speaks to all of the needs that we've been hearing prior to March 2020 and after March 2020. But as we talk about really catapulting our creative economy and our ecosystem, a few light years ahead of what had been a kind of static gig economy, subsistence, survival as a performing artist or a creator in Albuquerque, is that workforce development piece that we're not just seeing that, and I appreciate Clay mentioned this on the call that I shared with him yesterday, that it's not specific just to creative artists. I mean, the gig economy, right, is broader than creative artists. And so when you're talking about interventions to that economic system, it's more likely to get buy-in from, large municipalities and federal governments if that intervention benefits folks beyond the creative arts sector. It's how we make likely and unlikely bedfellows when we're all advocating in the same direction. And that was true in just what you said, Michael. It was very true in expanding unemployment benefits. It is equally true in workforce development for this new kind of virtual, that's where we're going to be. And a lot of, municipalities and governments were dragging their feet on kind of stepping into the new age, for lack of a better term. I'll steal Imagine Dragons lyrics there. But that this space, even we found it difficult because we manage museums, our department manages museums in Albuquerque, that even our education team was, they were struggling the first few months in the pandemic around, and these are really well-trained, well-experienced educators, but now this whole body of work that we have, and to be able to put that in a virtual space because it is the public's and it's public tax dollars that are paying for this programming, we have to figure out a way to get it to them better. Pandemic or no pandemic. And so this was really, it was a wake-up call for a lot of folks that were just you can't do things the way you've been doing it, and you won't be able to moving forward. That is true for artists, performing artists. I'm a poet when I'm not a bureaucrat as well. How are you putting your work out into the world? So these are really transferable work skills that we're talking about developing and investing in for future generations and not just for the future generations of artists. And I'll button that by also saying that the reason that we know that that particular element of this proposal is so on the right track, look at the commercial real estate market. They're already talking about retail office space being a thing of the past because most businesses are figuring out that having people work from home is a more efficient thing to do. So I don't need a lot of, strip mall office space anymore. I even heard something recently about doctors' offices beginning to move into malls because that's what they're talking about in the office space market. And so that is really the bellwether, the canary in the coal mine for this kind of virtual workforce development.
Can I just tag onto that, Michael? So I think, and this echoes something that you said at the start, which is that this is a hopeful document. And I think that we in this work have been trying to work from this mantra of finding the opportunity inside the crisis. And I think that what Hakim said about the state of the creative economy before any of this happened is really important. The creative economy was not a healthy place before this. It did not serve the bulk of the people that make up the creative economy well. And coming out of this, we can either go back to that or we can go to something better. And we have what we see as an opportunity to possibly get some federal assistance in transforming the creative economy temporarily, and then that federal assistance will leave and we'll have to have created models that can survive and thrive. But for example, some of the work that we're seeing in that happened pre-COVID, but things like AB5 in California, which were they're really challenging laws because of the creative economy's unhealthiness, but the premise of them, in that case, the idea that people who are essentially independent contractors but are working at for specific amounts of time in specific places deserve to be treated in the same way as other employees do. That's inherently a good idea. It just needs to be managed in a way that allows for our field as well as the other fields it actually was intended for to catch up. And that's what we hope this proposal provides in the guise of the development of a federal workforce program.
Mm-hmm. And something that again, we, really jumped out at us, and we're going to talk about this in the Seattle conversation in the next segment, but it feels like there's been an evolution in terms of public sector, either at the local, state, or federal level, really being more mindful about what is the intersection in terms of creative workers and creative perspectives inside the day-to-day work of how we operate, how government works, how we communicate, how we tell stories about how programs work, all these things. And so in Seattle, part of that was for a period of time, the Office of Music and Film being a cabinet level position to have access to all the other departments. We saw in the Obama administration, one of the things that we really applauded was a sort of notion, again, that part of the power of the National Endowment for the Arts is not simply in grant making, but is having access to all those other, leaders across the whole of government. And I love, again, part of what I feel like you're doing, what the field is doing in this approach is that it's taking that idea of like arts integration across these sectors in a way that is not temporary, is not based on like relief. It's more like just an evolution of how do we align these resources.
Well, and I think it's interesting because I think in a way it's not even something we have to take. It's just something we have to recognize.
Right.
I think that we, for some reason, have been very hesitant as a field to recognize that only less than 200 billion of the $878 billion that are generated each year are generated in the nonprofit space. That creative workers don't particularly care who they're working for in terms of their tax status. They just want to get paid and paid fairly. And more than that some of the stuff that Hakim is talking about, that the future evolution of this work is going to have to happen in concert with each other. And if there's one sort of underlying premise of this proposal, it is that, and that's part of the reason why it's so important to say that it was developed by 100 organizations in partnership, that it's important to say that 1,500 organizations and individuals have endorsed it so far, is that we can't get anywhere on our own. We have to move as a cohesive single creative economy in this conversation, because while we do carry something like 5% of the GDP, we don't carry that voice right now in these conversations about federal policy as well as state and local policy, except in certain pockets where there are very latent cities and states.
Right. So Hakim, back to you. I mean, I'm curious on your take on the tension between sort of the commercial and non-commercial sectors. So the the sort of quote unquote industry aspects of, music or spoken word, and how that sort of interplays with the more kind of non-commercial or public, kind of facing or public piece of arts, presenting and public art and things like that. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, I think part of what's interesting about bringing this conversation forward is for many, many people in the commercial sector and like independent venues and managers and others, this is a brand new conversation. And I'm just interested in your take on like, what becomes the interrelationship between, again, kind of the traditional commercial or business sector and then kind of the more non-commercial or public sector and how those fit.
Absolutely. That's you teed me up really well, because that's what I was going to like. I was trying to, after Clay, because I was like, I want to take us to a different space here. But I would want to say to what Clay said is that it is, when he mentions of 5%, in other sectors, they get to collectivize that, like even going as far as saying collective bargaining and, and having some sort of public interest, special interest representation at the table of policy. And, we don't have that. Like, we don't have that. And so I feel like this also codifies that. It kind of helps to bring that into policy. And when we were just talking yesterday, I like the fact that when you can embed it across different departments, like whether it's some of it's the small business administration, some of it is in the economic development, you like embed it in little pieces. And I've learned this in my second run here as being a bureaucrat in city government, that the more ways you can embed it budgetarily, if that's even a word, in different parts of the city government or federal government, the harder it is to remove, right? Especially on a whim of an administration change, right? And so I really think that's, to me, is the strength of the proposal that Americans for the Arts is putting forward. To get to what you were asking, I literally had this conversation, Michael, with Senator Udall's office. Anthony Cedillo is one of the guys in Senator Udall's office. And, we talked about so many things, all things New Mexico and the arts. But then we kind of talked about this moment of, like we were just saying a little bit earlier, the gig economy hasn't historically worked well for artists. Like it's been enough to get by. It's been enough to make rent. It's been enough to feed your kid occasionally and go and see a lot of places. But you weren't putting any money away, no retirement fund, no real safety net for yourself if something catastrophic happened in your life, a catastrophic life event happened. And so we know that wasn't working. As we look at moving forward and saying, okay, we're going to get out of this kind of psychology that we've had, that good art will rise to the top. If you're good at what you do, competition will breed, the market will reward you in a competitive market, right? In capitalism, if you're really that good at your music, you'll get paid and, you'll be off to the races like Maroon 5 or whatever you want to say. What we know is that that's really selective and that is hard to scale, even when there's a huge demand on different kinds of music. And it all rests on the idea that art is this subjective thing. Like if it's good, you get booked at this venue. If it's bad, you don't get booked at this venue. If it's good, you sell out. If it's bad, it doesn't sell out. And so that's a hard thing to now bring to the public sector where, we're not exactly, having those violent swings based on demand. We're just saying, how do we systemically pump resources into this sector so that, rising tide raises all boats and all ships. And so it's a really fundamental different way of thinking. And where Anthony and I were stuck as we were having this conversation, it was like, that's why it's a hard sell. Like even in city government, we manage a public art program. If you want to throw a mural up on a wall, a city wall with city dollars, it goes through a huge process that I know most artists are like, man, you guys are going to totally change my design or throw it out, in total. And it's just very different than the way that we've allowed art to exist in the past. And so the question is, how do we divorce art from taste and move it into, a utility like we've talked about with the internet? How do we move it into this thing that is actually a right of the commons?
So there's a lot in this conversation, and we're not going to obviously get to all of it today. I do want to just kind of build in, Hakim, on what you and I think Clay have been saying. I think it's important to recognize that everybody who does this work, has been doing it. I think Clay said it really well, because, the structures weren't working before. And the challenge, I think, for us as creative advocates or music advocates is to really think back to, again, what was the idea of market failure in the 1960s that led to the creation of Corporation for Public Broadcasting, that led to the creation of the NEA, the NEH. What is our version of that today? And how are we, sort of intentionally engaging in what the market structures are so we can be clear-eyed about what is going to happen in the commercial marketplace, what's not going to happen in the commercial marketplace, what is of value to us as a society, how do we fund it and prioritize it? How do we look at what other nations do for models that aren't exactly going to work here, but are ideas that we can learn from or potentially kind of shape, and just do the incremental work to try to make a stronger, more resilient, more equitable, better sort of music ecosystems and cultural ecosystems. And again, I think Clay, the work that you're speaking of today is so important, again, because we all have. I think we're done with conversations about conversations. Right? Like, we don't need platitudes. We don't need music's really important. We don't need go art. We need what do we actually do? What are frameworks so we can get our head around that then can lead to actual substantive change? And again, the coalition or the collaborative way that you all are addressing this, I think, is really something that we appreciate. Could you speak, and we just have a minute or two left in this segment, but could you speak a little bit about the endorsement process and the next steps, and so
Sure.
people in this meeting, how they can engage in this other than just reading the docs?
Yeah, absolutely. So the link that is in the chat, americansforthearts.org/creative work, has a click-through on it once you've read the proposal. If you are able to endorse it either as an individual or as a designated representative from an organization, you would be joining nearly 1,600 organizations and creative workers who have endorsed the proposal so far. And that's really important in itself because it shows the breadth of support for these ideas. We have already delivered this proposal to the Biden campaign. We are in the process of delivering it to the Trump campaign. We will be working on putting it, after they get through what is hopefully a successful relief conversation, putting this in front of all of the people in both houses of Congress. We're also specifically trying to aim it at people who are up for election or re-election, so that they can think about putting some of these ideas into their planks and platforms as they're thinking about it. We also are getting really close to the election, so this is not just focused on the next 39 days. And in fact, there's a lot of work that's going to happen between now and, say, the end of the year, including stuff where all of you can be involved. So if you choose to endorse the proposal, there'll be an opportunity in the next few weeks to begin collaborating with your fellow endorsers, if you want to build out each of these 15 glimmers of an idea into true and specific policy. And that's being done in conjunction with the initial coalition that developed it, which is called the Getting Creative Workers Working Coalition. You're also welcome to join that. You can email me and I can set you up with that. And then it's also going to be in collaboration with other state and local and federal partners as we try to turn each of these things into something that, whether it becomes federal policy or not, is the spark of a really great idea that emerged from a cohesive field. And so, as we get towards January, as we get towards, the first day of the next administration, the first 100 days of that next administration, we believe that there are specific actions that need to be taken in that time if they're going to be taken. And we've lined those up first. And we hope that we're grabbing the right ears and that some of those in some form or other end up happening. We don't have any illusions that this exact language is going to be adopted directly into federal policy. But if at the end of this we get some direct support in some form or other for the creative economy and creative workers, it will be really, really important as we try and move our whole sector from relief and into recovery, and as we try to rethink and reimagine what the creative economy is for ourselves and for all of these communities out in the United States.
Clay, that's so well done. And Hakim, thanks as always for joining us. We're excited. We're going to be, as Music Policy Forum is going to be as engaged in this as you'll let us. And for folks watching today, feel free to ping us again at musicpolicyforum@gmail.com if you want to brainstorm about what this stuff means for you and your community. And also, again, reach out to Clay, reach out to Hakim. This is all about networks and collaboration and information sharing. So thanks again. Great work. And looking forward to seeing where this all goes.